The North Atlantic in February is not water but liquid iron, a churning expanse that grinds the soul to salt and marrow. I remember the cold not as a sensation, but as a presence. It coiled through the bridge of HMCs, infiltrating wool, seeping into bone, whispering through the rivets of the hull like some spectral quartermaster tallying our frailty. It was 1943, the war's black hinge, and we were escorting Convoy ON-166 westward. 37 merchantmen huddled like frightened sheep beneath a sky stitched shut with cloud. My hands, gloved in oil-stiffened leather, rested lightly on the chart table. My eyes, though dry from lack of sleep, held steady on the flickering green glow of the Type 144 ASDIC display. Beneath us, the sea groaned low, guttural, the sound of pressure meeting despair. I was Lieutenant Alistair V. Croft, 28 years of age, son of a Cambridge Doan who'd never set foot on anything smaller than a punt, and now commander of an aging Flower-class corvette whose engine note carried the wheeze of a consumptive tenor. My uniform, though pressed with stubborn devotion the night before, reeked of damp wool, diesel, and the faint metallic tang of fear, though I'd sooner have swallowed a depth charge than name it aloud. The bridge crew moved with the quiet urgency of men who knew silence was armor. Seaman Briggs stood watch at the port rail, his breath pluming in short, sharp bursts. Coxswain Macready adjusted the rudder trim with the tenderness of a midwife, and Ensign Price Borelli 20, with eyes too wide for his face, hovered near the wireless set, awaiting the hourly signal from Admiralty in Liverpool. It came at 0317 hours, a curt, coded transmission on the 500 kHz distress frequency. U-boat contact, grid AE94. Possible wolfpack converging. Maintain zigzag pattern delta. Confirm receipt. The message crackled through the ether like a dry branch snapping in frost. Price turned to me, pencil hovering over the logbook, his knuckles white. "They're asking for confirmation, sir." His voice was thinner than I remembered. I said nothing, not because I lacked words, but because the silence had already spoken for me. The truth was coiled in my gut. We'd lost a stick contact an hour prior, a faulty hydrophone array, and though I'd filed the report, no relief had come. The convoy behind USMPI Unity, Fort McMurray, the Dutch freighter Jan van Gelder sailed, blind in the wake of our failure. To confirm receipt would be to affirm our operational readiness, to assure the Admiralty that we held the line. But we did not. And yet, if I refused I signaled our weakness to Convoy would be delaying critical war material by days, perhaps weeks. Lives in London, in Glasgow, depended on those holds. Tinplate, timber, blood plasma, my breath caught against the weight of arithmetic no ethics textbook had prepared me for. Outside, the sea slapped against the hull with rhythmic indifference. A Olympusably alive in that wasteland screamed overhead, its cry swallowed instantly by fog. I looked at Price, at the boyish expectation in his eyes, at the unspoken trust that officers knew what to do when the world narrowed to a single, terrible choice. I could not meet his gaze. Instead, I nodded once, slow, deliberate, my chin dipping toward my chest as though in prayer. "E ricordati," receipt confirmed. 0318. The lie bloomed in the log like an ink stain, spreading unseen into the future. Minutes later, the first explosion tore the night apart. It came from astern, a concussive bloom of orange light that turned the fog to stained glass, followed by the dreadful, elongated groan of a ship breaking its spine. Empire Unity, I thought, though I dared not turn to look. The shockwave rattled the bridge windows, and for a heartbeat the world held its breath. Then chaos, bells clanging, voices barking coordinates, the diesel engines surging as Macready threw the throttles wide. We turned hard to starboard, knifing through swell toward the ruin, depth charges racked and ready. On the ASDIC, echoes returned too many, too close, like rats, scuttling through the walls of a sinking house. I gave the order to drop patterns Alpha and Gamma from the stern rails. The charges fell with a heavy, hollow clunk, then vanished beneath the waves. Seconds later, the sea erupted in gizzering violence, white fire boiling upward, shaking the Thetis like a terrier with a rat. But the U-boats were clever. They'd learned to dive beneath the blast radius, to glide through the chaos like surgeons through an operating theater. We chased phantoms for hours, our sonar pinging into emptiness, while behind us, the cries of survivors, Tosafu, woe deep beaten the oil-slicked water, and the cold faded into the groan of the ocean. Dawn came not with light, but with a slow leaching of darkness. Gray, bleeding into grayer, the convoy had scattered, some ships already vanished over the horizon, others limping, wounded. We picked up 11 men from the water, their skin blue-white, lips cracked with salt, eyes hollowed by the sight of comrades slipping beneath the waves without a sound. I stood on the fantail as they were hauled aboard, blankets draped over shaking shoulders, and one of the M.A. Stoker from Fort McMurray, his hands blistered from steam burns, stared directly at me, not with accusation, not wheat rach, but with a stillness that was worse. He knew, or perhaps he merely felt the shape of the lie in the air, as one feels the shift in pressure before a storm. I returned to the bridge, my boots heavy with spray and guilt. The wireless remained silent. No reprimand, no inquiry, only the endless, rhythmic slap of waves against steel, and the unspoken knowledge that in the ledger of this war, some debts are paid not in blood, but in silence. That evening, as the watch changed, and the aurora borealis flickered faintly beyond the crow, Esnesta, pale green shroud over the Arctic circuli, stood alone at the chart table, tracing our false course with a trembling finger. The log lay open to the entry. Contact confirmed. All systems nominal. Outside, the wind picked up, keening through the rigging like a mourner who has forgotten the name of the dead. I thought of my father, in his study at Trinity, sipping claret while reading Tacitus by lamplight. The higher the office, the greater the sin of omission, he'd once said. Not unkindly, during a debate on civic duty. I had scoffed then, wrapped in the arrogance of youth. Now, I understood. Omission is not absent. It is a kind of architecture, an invisible scaffold upon which consequences are built, beam by beam, until the whole edifice collapses under its own silence. And still, the sea rolled on. The weeks that followed wore the illusion of routine, but routine is only repetition when it is unburdened by memory. Ours was repetition steeped in dread. We returned to Londonderry, with half our complement of depth charges spent, our fuel tanks near empty, and the faces of the rescued men seared into the backs of our eyelids. Admiralty's report on Convoy ON-166 cited heavy losses, but successful evasion of primary wolfpack concentration, and commended HMCS Titus for steadfast escort conduct under duress. I read the dispatch in the wardroom. The paper crisp as bone, the ink smelling faintly of linseed and bureaucracy. My signature had already been appended to the after-action. Summary: another nod, another silence ratified in triplicate. Spring came late to the North Atlantic that year, and when it did, it arrived not with birdsong but with a thinning of the fog and a slight softening of the gale aspite. Yet nothing softened within me. The lie had taken root, not as a single splinter, but as a slow rot in the grain of my conscience. I found myself watching my crew more closely, not with the vigilance of command, but with the guilt of a man who had traded their trust for expediency. Price, especially, became a mirror I could not avoid. He still brought me the daily wireless logs with the same earnest efficiency, but his eyes no longer held that untested reverence. They flickered now away from mine toward the sea, toward the logbook, as though he sensed the hollowness beneath my orders. In May, we were assigned to Convoy HX-237, outbound from Halifax. This time, the U-boats were bolder, emboldened by new METUX radar detectors that rendered our Type 271 surface search radar all but blind. The Admiralty had issued updated protocols. Escort commanders were to maintain tighter screening formations and report any ASDIC anomalies immediately, without hesitation or presumption of insignificance. The words stung like salt in a wound. I had done precisely that presumed insignificance. Men had drowned for it. The night of May 10th, we intercepted a faint HFDF bearing 286 degrees, originating from a point just beyond the starboard flank. It was weak, fragmented, but unmistakable. The telltale chirp of a U-boat transmitting to Befehlshaber der U-Boote. My fingers hovered over the wireless key. Protocol demanded immediate action. Vector destroyers. Illuminate the quadrant with starshell. Broadcast a warning on 8,415 kHz to all convoy vessels. But a part of me, the part that had nodded instead of speaking, hesitated. What if it was a decoy? What if the signal was bait, meant to draw escorts from their stations? The wolfpacks had grown cunning. They knew how to mimic distress, how to feign weakness. My mind raced through contingencies, each more paralyzing than the last. In that suspended moment, I made no decision and indecision. I learned too late. Is itself a choice. At 01 for 7 hours, SS Irish Oak exploded amid. Not one of our convoys was neutral, sailing alone under the Irish tricolour, but close enough that we saw the fireball bloom like a second moon. Fragments of hull rained down on our deck for minutes afterward. I ordered a course change to render 8, but Macredia man, who de lost 2 brothers to U-48 off Cape Wrath, gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles whitened and said, voice low and gravelled, "They'll be waiting in the smoke." Sir, he was right. The sea was calm. The night moonless, perfect conditions for an ambush. We stood off at 800 yards, listening to the screams warp into silence as the cold claimed them one by one. 20 lives gone in the time it takes to recite the Lord's Prayer. And I had done nothing. Again, back in port, rumors swirled. The sinking of the Irish Oak sparked diplomatic outrage. London disavowed knowledge. Berlin claimed it was a legitimate target, disguised as neutral. But among the escort crews, the whispers were sharper. Thetis had been closest. Thetis hadn't fired a single depth charge. Thetis and her commander were growing cautious to the point of timidity. I heard it in the mess, in the clipped tones during drills, in the way the junior ratings no longer met my eye during inspections. My authority, once assumed as naturally as the tide, now required constant assertion. I compensated with rigor-tighter watches, stricter log checks, endless drills, but discipline cannot rebuild trust once it has been hollowed from within. Then came June 21st. We were patrolling the western approaches, hunting a suspected U-boat refueling group near the Porcupine Bank. The sea was glassy, the sky streaked with mares' tails, fishermen's promise of wind within the day. At 14:33 hours, ASDIC returned a solid echo at 300 yards, bearing 192, depth 60 meters, steady, submerged. I ordered silent running engines, throttled to idle. All non-essential systems shut down. Crew instructed to move only on felt soles. The Thetis became a ghost of itself, sliding through the water with the grace of a predator. For 23 minutes, we stalked the contact. The tension on the bridge was so thick you could taste it metallic, like blood on the tongue. Then, without warning, the echo vanished. Not feathered, not evaded, vanished. As though the submarine had simply ceased to exist. Price checked the hydrophones. Nothing but the groan of distant freighters, and the whisper of plankton against the hull. I stared at the blank screen, my heart hammering not with fear, but with a terrible, clarifying certainty. It was a trap. They had let us follow, lured us into isolation, and now somewhere in the depths the wolfpack would be converging. I turned to issue evasive orders, but before I could speak, the ship shuddered violently. Not an explosion too soft for that, but a deep, resonant thud amidships, followed by the hiss of seawater breaching the lower decks. A torpedo, set to magnetic pistol, had detonated just beneath the waterline. It hadn't torn us apart. It had crippled us with surgical precision. Steam pipes burst in the engine room. Lights flickered. The alarm clanged like a death knell. I shouted for damage control, for sonar sweep, for starshell butt. My voice sounded distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Through the bridge windows, I saw the sea begin to churn, not from our wake, but from below. Periscopes. 3 of them, rising like black needles from the deep. They held their positions, watching, waiting, and then I understood. They weren't going to finish us. Not yet. This was punishment. Or perhaps a message. In the grey light, I saw it clearly. They knew, not from intercepted signals or decrypted Enigma traffic, but from the pattern of my silence, from the way I had failed to act when action was due. The Kriegsmarine, for all its ruthlessness, understood the language of omission, as well as any. They had let us limp away before. Now they showed us what true consequence looked like. We survived, by grace of a trawler, from convoy SC-131, that spotted our distress rockets and drew the U-boats away, with a feint. The Thetis limped into Liverpool under tow, her hull patched with timbered and prayers. One submitted my report that same night. No omissions. I wrote of the faulty astic, of the nod that passed for confirmation, of the hesitation off the Porcupine Bank. I named every failure, as if carving them into stone. 3 days later, I received orders. Relieved of command, reassigned to shore duties in Portsmouth, pending review. I did not protest. There was a strange relief in it, like the lifting of a fever. Now, as I sit in this damp room overlooking the Solent, the sea still calls not as a threat, but as a witness. The war will end some day. Men will return to pubs and parlors, to wives and quiet streets, and they will speak of courage and sacrifice as though those were the only currencies of conflict. But I know better. I know that wars are also won and lost in the spaces between words and nods given instead of truths spoken, in silences mistaken for strength. The Thetis sails on under new command. The convoys still move. And I carried the weight of what I did not say, what I did not do, what I let drown in the cold dark while I stood on the bridge and nodded instead. Outside, the tide turns, the gulls cry, and the sea, indifferent as ever, rolls on.